Okay, I'm Alexa Lam. I am now teaching as a professor in the University of Hong Kong. I'm teaching securities law and global reforms. Now, prior to the university, I joined the university last year. Prior to that, I was the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission. So that's the Hong Kong equivalent of your SEC plus CFTC rolled together. And the reason why I am in Wyoming is a long story, but to cut it short, I met Mark Gordon, your treasurer, in London last year, towards the end of the year. I was speaking at an investment conference in London, and he was there. We started to talk. He introduced me to Wyoming and the fund that they have, and some of the issues that they're grappling with. And then he invited me. He said that they are organizing a conference here, and he wanted me to come and share the experience that we have from Hong Kong, and also my experience having dealt with China, particularly with respect to the opening up of China's capital market, their reforms, and how Hong Kong has helped China or worked together with China in opening up her market. So I am here. This is my first time. I'm really impressed. It's a beautiful stage. And the conference over the last 2 days, in my view, was a huge success because Mark was able to bring together experts in the field from all over the world. You know, I'm from Hong Kong, and he has people from as far as New Zealand, from the Middle East, and also from all over the country, from the UK, Canada. So it's a world grouping of experts to talk specifically about many of the issues that surround sovereign wealth funds. Now, what I tried to do was, I felt that the best way I can contribute value is to share with them the experience that Hong Kong has had with respect to our fund. We also have a fund which we call the Exchange Fund. It's a little different from, say, your fund, because our Exchange Fund, in fact, was set up in 1935. And originally, it was set up to fully back the Hong Kong currency. So that was during the British colonial era. But the fund has continued, and today, it has two main purposes. The first one still is to fully back the Hong Kong currency, because as you know, the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar. It's a hard peg. And by hard, I mean, if you were to go to the Hong Kong Monetary Authority or the government, and you say, okay, here are my Hong Kong dollars, I want US dollars in return, and they are obligated to pay you US dollars at the exchange rate of 7.8 or 7. There's a band, it's between 7.75 to 7.8. So they're bound. Now for that, they have to have a fund so that they can fully back up this peg, right? So that's the first and most important function or mandate of the fund. And the second purpose of the fund is that it can be used by the financial secretary in any manner that he thinks fit in order to preserve and protect the monetary and financial systems of Hong Kong. So it has to do with monetary and financial stability. And we had an experience in 1998 during the Asian financial crisis, when there was a serious run on the Hong Kong dollar because the hedge funds were there, and the feeling was the Hong Kong dollar, the peg would go, because that was right in the middle of the crisis. It started with Thailand. The baht fell apart. That was on July 2nd, 1997. Then very quickly, the contagion spread to, it was Indonesia. The rupiah just collapsed, and then the Korean won, and then Malaysia got into trouble. And at that time, Hong Kong was extremely jittery. There were bank runs. There were people lining up to try and withdraw their money from the banks. There were rumors that some of the companies were close to bankruptcy. So confidence was extremely shaky. And what the hedge funds had done was they were massively short the Hong Kong dollar. Now, for the Hong Kong dollar to collapse, they would need to completely spook out the locals. Because if the locals were to all dump their Hong Kong dollars, there was no way that the government could support it. But if the locals were not spooked out, if they did not go out to dump their dollars, there was no way the hedge funds would win, because the fund, the exchange fund, would be sufficient to fully back the peg, right? So what the hedge funds did then was they mounted what we call a cross-market manipulation. So first they shorted the Hong Kong dollar, then they shorted the stock index, the futures, then they pushed down the cash. So they shorted the cash stocks, they got contracts to short the futures, and if the futures were down, then of course your cash market would go down, and your cash market goes down, your futures market would go further down, so it's spiraling down. And at some point, the locals would be completely scared, and they would dump their dollars. They would all go and want conversion of their Hong Kong dollars into US dollars, and that would be when the Hong Kong dollar would collapse. And so what the Hong Kong government did was, for 2 weeks, in the latter part of August 1998, they used the exchange fund to go into the market to buy whatever shares there were on the market which wanted to be sold at whatever the price was. So the instructions from the government to the brokers was, we want to buy all the index stocks that people want to sell. And we would buy it at the cost that they want to sell at, because the purpose is to intervene in the market, to give the market a floor or a support, so to speak, so that this would stop further spiraling down, because this spiraling down is malicious, there's malice behind it. So for 2 weeks that happened, and at the end of the month, the hedge funds, they didn't go. They did not square the position. They rolled over their contract. So it wasn't clear then that the Hong Kong government had actually won the battle of the day, but the futures contracts are a monthly contract. So they lost money because the government came in to support the market. So the futures went up. So these contracts, they were in the red. So what they did was they paid further margin, they held on for another month. But then LTCM collapsed in New York, so the hedge funds had to bring their money back to New York to help their positions back in New York. That was in early September. So they finally left, and that was the end of it. Now, during the intervention, it was extremely controversial, because the feeling was, you're the government, you shouldn't be intervening, you should not be coming into the market as a player yourself, because this, is not right. And the government's point was, there is a clear purpose behind this. We are intervening because we saw this cross-market manipulation. And we had to do this, otherwise, if the Hong Kong dollar peg were to go, the whole economy would suffer pretty much like the Indonesian economy or the Thai economy or the Korean economy, because they needed IMF bailout packages, right? Now, what was clear, however, was that the government's use of the exchange fund was completely legitimate, because the mandate said very clearly that the fund's primary purpose was to protect and fully back the currency, which is exactly what it was doing at that time. So the point I wanted to make to the audience was, what is most important as a sovereign fund is that the mandate must be very clear. The objective must be very transparent, so that when the fund is used for whatever purposes it is supposed to be used for, there will be no challenge. That's very important. Now, Hong Kong was very fortunate that one, we had sufficient money in the fund for that particular purpose, and two, also events came into our favor because of LTCM, right? But that was the experience I shared with the audience yesterday. Well, as an outsider, I think Wyoming is very fortunate that back in the early 1970s, your state leaders had the vision and the foresight to have created this particular fund. I understand, I was reading the literature, I understand that at that time it was also controversial, but they managed to have the law passed, and I think the Constitution had to be amended in order for the fund to be established and to be in operation. So I think the people of Wyoming are very lucky. Now, the funding comes from a severance tax from the minerals, right? So in the good times, of course, the fund would have a lot of incoming funding. But in tough times, that incoming funding may dry up, which is one of the issues that the people here have to consider. I mean, even though it hasn't dried up, but it's not as good as the old times, right? And people also talked about extensively yesterday about, going forward, the carbon issues. And even though Wyoming has, I think, like 400 years of coal resources still underground, but the thing is, times have changed, and the types of resources that people want are also changing. So I think it is important for the people here to start thinking about the longer term future of the fund and what exactly it's for. Now, I understand also that apart from the Mineral Trust Fund, you also have the Rainy Day Fund. And there is a bit of controversy, as I understand, as to what exactly the Rainy Day Fund is for and what it should be used for. And because of that, actually I shared with them also the story of one of Singapore's sovereign wealth funds. Singapore has two. One of them is Temasek. Temasek is a corporation, so it's set up under the Singapore Corporation Act. Now, this fund specifically, it says very clearly, it is a generational investor. It is supposed to invest for the generations to come. That's very important. So what it's doing is it's not just strategically investing so that it brings in returns in the form of just cash or money, but it is investing for better economies, to grow the middle class, to make their lives better, like for cleaner air, better water, because Singapore also has a water problem. So I share with them the experience of Temasek, because what Temasek is doing is that it is not just investing for purposes of getting in more cash. It is investing for the community, not just in Singapore, but beyond, because they have the wisdom to see that for Singapore to be able to enjoy and maintain its wealth, it needs to make sure that its neighbors are also wealthy. That's very important. So that's why they're investing not just in Singapore, but in the larger Asia area. They have invested quite heavily in China, also in Taiwan. They have been in Hong Kong and all over the region. Now, one of the projects that they are doing, which I think is really interesting, is they are now renewing, or I'm not sure what's the term, but there is an area in Singapore which is a rainforest. So what they want to do is they want to preserve this rainforest and build it into a park. And the object is, this is a rainforest park for the future generations of Singapore so that they can enjoy and appreciate their cultural and natural heritage. Now, I think something like this is really great. There can be a debate as to whether this is something which the government instead of a wealth fund should do. However, I think it is the right thing for Temasek to do this, because this is not just like investing in something which doesn't bring any return, like, you know, building up the education system. Then clearly something like that will be squarely for the government and not for a wealth fund. But this is like building a park, which clearly they would be able to bring in returns, maybe not 10 years, but 20 years, 30 years, but it's long term. And sovereign wealth funds are about longer term welfare and wealth of the people for whom the fund serves, right?